Avengers Endgame, Lion King, Spider-Man Far From Home, Captain Marvel, Toy Story 4, Aladdin, Joker, and Hobbs and Shaw. These are the 8 highest grossing films worldwide in 2019, and you might notice a pattern between all of them, considering that they're all films in established franchises or remakes of classic films. Hi, I'm Collin Jackson. I'm an independent film writer and director, film critic, and film connoisseur, and I think we should talk about how the lack of originality in Hollywood movies is such a problem nowadays. Now, it should be noted that franchises aren't inherently bad in and of themselves, and they're not even necessarily a new thing. I mean, franchises like James Bond and Star Trek have been going on for over half a century now. And it's not like there aren't any new original movies that are coming out, they're just not nearly as visible or commercially successful or even in the public eye. And that's the thing that I think the industry really needs to address. So what really is so bad about having so many franchises and cinematic universes like DCEU and the MCU and Star Wars and all those kind of things? Well, the problem is that these are all that the studios want to make because they're inherently less risky. In a lot of ways, making a Hollywood movie is like going to a Vegas casino. The movie studios often roll the dice with hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, and they really are taking a gamble as to what movies will actually turn profits and which ones won't. And the studio's looking for a lot of ways to reduce risk, and because people already know and have nostalgia for popular characters and popular franchises and pre-existing stories, the studios consider this to often be less risky. The problem is, however, is that in the past decade or so, these popular franchises and characters have gotten a lot more nostalgia coming for them. Movies especially like Star Wars and Marvel comic books. And so people flock to see these movies, and the studios only make these movies because when they put $300 million on the line, more on that later, that's all they want to make because it's less risky. The problem is, however, all these franchises had to start somewhere. They had to start from an original idea. Like in 1977, Star Wars was not a pre-existing property. It was expected to fail. But George Lucas was a filmmaker with only a couple films under his belt, and he wanted to tell a story, an original new story, and it became successful. And if we never have any more original films, how can we create the new stories that will be created, how can we have the new stories that will be enjoyed for generations and the new classics? And eventually, people will get tired of every franchise that keeps getting more and more movies regurgitated out to them. People will get franchise fatigue. We've seen that with Star Trek when Star Trek was going on for too long, and people are starting to see that with Star Wars, and it will happen with the MCU eventually. So in a way, studios are shooting themselves in the foot in the long term by not focusing on more original movies. So for studios to focus more on original movies, instead of putting all of their eggs into a couple huge baskets, instead of just putting like $300 million into 3 or 4 tentpole films that they need to succeed, what film studios used to do, and what they should at least go back to in some capacity, is take that $300 million, or that $1.2 billion you're spending on all your movies that year, and instead of putting it into 2 or 3 films, sprinkle it into, say, 10 or 12 medium-sized films, or even low-budget films. And then, if you have a couple flop, that's not nearly so bad because you're not out so much money. And when you have the big successes and the big blockbusters like the original Star Wars in 1977, which were made on a much more modest budget, then the studios will be able to recuperate all that money from the other films, and none of the other films will be such a big loss. And that's when original ideas can be less risky, because when studios aren't gambling nearly so much money, and they don't need to gamble that much money, then the studio will be much more willing to give new filmmakers and new ideas a chance.